Gillenwater. It's not a Dutch name. It does not mean screaming water. It is pretty long altogether, Zoe Mickley Gillenwater, so I abbreviate it to Zomigi on Twitter, which is kind of cut off there, Zomigi. I'm also a mom. My kids go to Dutch public school here in Amsterdam, Oost, and they speak excellent Nederlands, so I'm told. I don't have that skill myself to be able to really evaluate that. I'm also a senior designer at Booking.com here in Amsterdam. I've been doing web design professionally for about 15 years. This is my first portfolio site. It was fixed width, but not only that, it was fixed height. So you can see that the circle background was cut off on the bottom because I designed it to only fit maximized 800 by 600 windows. And not only were fixed width sites the thing back then, but you had to lay them out with HTML tables, not CSS. So here's my layout with the borders turned on, so you can see the ridiculous table structure that I used to get everything in the place where I wanted it. Thankfully, I did finally learn about CSS layout, and for some reason I got really into liquid layout. That's what we used to call fluid layout. So around 2004, I started making all of my sites with CSS floats, and most of them liquid. And I loved it so much that I wrote a whole book about designing and building fluid sites back in 2008, Flexible Web Design. I was excited to see it in a bookstore back when we had bookstores again. And CSS float layout was so much better than table layout, but it still had problems. Since then, we have started using display table cell and inline-block, but they have problems for layout as well. We've had to figure out tricks and workarounds for things like float containment, equal height columns, vertical centering, and responsive web design has just made this harder because now we aren't just worried about pixels, but about a mix of units of measurements in our layout, and ensuring that our boxes wrap at the right spots and don't wrap when we don't want them to. And we have to do it all with the same HTML source order throughout, which limits where we can place things on the page visually. So Flexbox solves a lot of these issues. It gives you the flexibility to quickly and easily add, resize, and rearrange sections of a layout. And you can use it on fixed width layouts, but its advantages are most evident with fluid layouts because the children of flex containers can flex their size, either growing to fill unused space or shrinking to avoid overflowing. And it's especially useful in responsive web design because you can avoid having to set explicit dimensions and have your layout change automatically at different viewport widths and even reorder boxes from their native spots in the HTML. Flexible box layout module. This is a little bit cut off, but basically I just love seeing all this green here. It has been around for quite a few years now. It has gathered a lot of browser support. I really like that 93% number there. So all the major mobile browsers support it. On desktop, almost all of your users will see Flexbox 2. You're missing IE9 and earlier, which according to Can I Use have less than 4% of global market share. This 4% doesn't mean don't use Flexbox. This means don't use Flexbox in a way that makes things look like crap on those browsers. Use it as progressive enhancement. But maybe you're thinking, yeah, but you don't know about the browser usage stats for my site. I still have to support IE8. To which I would respond, I totally understand. I still have to support IE7, but I use Flexbox in my work at Booking.com. And I don't have some magical JS polyfill that allows me to do this. I just use it in small bits as progressive enhancement. There's so many ways to use Flexbox on components of the page rather than the whole page layout in a way where non-supporting browsers still get an acceptable fallback experience. You're probably already applying bits of advanced CSS here and there without worrying that old versions of IE don't see your gradients and transitions and other nice little enhancements that you've added. If you've done your job right, users of old IE will not know that there's a difference because that difference doesn't look bad or broken. And that's the same way that I want you to think about and use Flexbox, especially when it comes to responsive web design because it can be a tremendous tool for enhancing responsiveness. It may sound weird to talk about enhancing responsiveness, but I don't think of responsive web design as being on or off. Either site is responsive or it's not. I think it's a continuum. So if you have a fluid layout, fluid content, and some media queries, your site includes responsiveness. It's on that end of the continuum, but there's always more that you could do to make it even more responsive to different user settings and the content within it. Flexbox can be tricky to wrap your head around at first, but once you have learned it, it's an incredibly quick and easy way to just quickly add more responsiveness to your components. There's two main ways that I think Flexbox can enhance responsive web design that I want to focus on today. The first is to make better use of space, no matter what the user's current screen size is and where it falls between the breakpoints. And the second is to reorder content to different visual placements at different screen sizes. So let me show you several demos of responsive components that I can add Flexbox to improve their sizing and spacing. We'll start with this simple nav bar. There's not many links in the nav bar, so at all viewport widths, they can remain centered in a row under the logo. There's nothing fancy about this, but again, nothing broken or wrong looking. This works in a responsive page. But there's no reason why I can't add a few lines of Flexbox on top of this CSS to enhance the responsiveness of the nav further. So these links can be inline-block and flex items at the same time. To make the links flex items, I set display flex on list nav, which is their parent UL. This turns on Flexbox and makes the UL a flex container. And it indicates that you're using this new visual formatting model on its children, which are now called flex items. Setting display to flex also automatically sets flex direction to its default value of row, which controls the flow direction of the flex items within the container and sets that main axis that they lay out on. So even if I left off this second line, the children LI would become flex items laid out on a single horizontal line. And so far, nothing has changed in appearance by adding Flexbox. I still just have a centered nav. But now that the LI are flex items, I can take advantage of Flexbox's advanced alignment properties. For instance, what if I wanted the nav to stretch to fill the full width, with the first link flush left, the last link flush right, and then equal spaces in between? You'd probably first turn to display table cell, and you would be able to make the nav full width with the first and last links at the edges. And you could even make each link box equal width using table layout fixed. But you discovered that you could not get equal spacing between the text block of each link. So see, if I do display table and table layout fixed on the UL, it makes each LI the same width. So they look equally spaced if they have backgrounds or borders. But if I remove the backgrounds and borders, you see that the gaps between the actual links text is not equal. So longer links have smaller spaces around them and shorter links have bigger spaces. So display table cell won't work for my particular nav with no backgrounds. Instead, I can use Flexbox's justify content property set to space between to equally space to move the first and last LI items to the edges and then equally distribute the remaining space in between the links. The justify content property is set on the flex container, and it aligns the children flex items along the main axis, which again is the flow direction set by the flex direction property. So in this case, my main axis is horizontal because my flex items are laid out in a row, so justify content affects their horizontal alignment. And I can still use both inline-block and Flexbox together on this nav so that the items will be centered in non-Flexbox browsers and full width in Flexbox browsers. And I don't need to hide anything here from non-supporting browsers or vice versa, which makes this enhancement really easy to add. It's just these two lines in pink that are all the Flexbox that I need to layer on. And here's how the nav then looks on medium width screens. The links stretch out in the Flexbox version. So having the nav filling the full width looks great on medium width screens like this, but on really wide screens, it starts looking too stretched out. I wanted to make it more responsive to this extra space, so I decided to use Flexbox to pin the first two links to the left of the logo and the last two links to the right side. So first I add a media query for wide screens. And I also need to add a link to the modernizer script because I do need to feed some styles to only Flexbox browsers in this particular case, as you'll see. Much of the time, Flexbox and fallback styles can coexist, as they did with the earlier version of the nav that I just showed you that used inline-block and Flexbox at the same time. But occasionally, your styles will conflict, and you'll only want to apply a certain property if Flexbox is in effect or vice versa. And so the modernizer script is perfect for this, since it can detect whether the browser supports Flexbox, supports the old version or doesn't support it, and then it adds the appropriate classes to the HTML tag. So here I used Modernizer's Flexbox class to scope this new rule to only Flexbox browsers, where I want the nav to move up on the same line as the logo. So non-supporting browsers won't use this rule, so they'll still get the inline block centered nav beneath the logo. Only the Flexbox version of the nav will move up. And now to move the last two links to the right side, I simply set margin left auto on the third link, the throw a party link. Again, scope to only Flexbox browsers. And the reason that this works is that in Flexbox, if you set a margin in the main axis to auto, that margin will take up all of the free space left. This isn't a hack. Someone asked me that once. Is this a hack? No, this is new behavior that has been defined for how margin auto works in the Flexbox spec. So with margin left auto on that throw a party link, the browser places all of that extra space in the line to its left. So this pink box is basically where its margin would be. It basically pushes that third link to the right side and everything after it. So I get the appearance of a split list without having to cheat and break this into two lists, which is less accessible and robust, and it doesn't really make sense for responsive web design either, where I need to have the same HTML at all viewport widths. So this is a simple nav bar, but thanks to a bit of Flexbox, it can make full use of this changing width. Flexbox increases its responsiveness as an enhancement where available. Flexbox is not only a great way to make use of the changing widths in a responsive layout, but also to make better use of the changing heights. So as the viewport changes width, the content wraps differently, of course, so you can't count on constant heights for your content blocks. Flexbox can enhance the appearance of this variable height because it works in any direction. So let's say that I want to show some social media icons or whatnot down the side of this article or media object. And each will have a wrapper class and then two blocks inside, icons and content. The media object content varies, as does the viewport width, which controls wrapping, so the height of each varies. So if I want to equally space the icons vertically to take up the full height, I'm out of luck. I can't explicitly set each to height 33% because the parent media object has no explicitly set height to base this percentage off of, so the height property would do nothing here. But I don't need the height property with Flexbox. First, I make the icons section and the content section flex items with default horizontal row alignment. And I do this because I need them to be equal height, and sibling flex items are equal height by default thanks to the line items property set to stretch by default. You can't see it here because the icons are still top aligned, but if the two sections had background colors, you would see that the icons section stretches to match the height of the content section. So the align items property is set on the flex container, and it aligns flex items in the cross axis. So this media object uses the default flex direction row. So the main axis is horizontal. That means the cross axis is vertical. That means align items affects the item's vertical alignment in this case. So again, justify content controls the alignment in the main axis, and align items controls it in the cross axis. So now that the icon so now the icon and content section are equal height flex items, but the individual icon images are not, because only children of a flex container become flex items, not all the descendants. But something can be both a flex item and a flex container. So I turn the icon section into a flex container, and that makes its 3 children icon images flex items. But this time I set flex direction to column to stack them vertically. So the default value of row that we've seen so far places items side by side, but the column value lays them out vertically from top to bottom. And this doesn't change anything visually yet. They already were stacked vertically. But remember that flex direction also controls the main axis. So with flex direction column, the icon's main axis is now vertical. So I can use justify content space between to equally space them over the height, no matter what it is. So here's the result. Each media object has a different height, but the icons always span the full height with equal spaces in between. To make this work with non-Flexbox browsers, you can use whatever technique you normally would to get the icon block to sit next to the content block, such as display table cell or floating. Both of these can exist with Flexbox. I'm not going to walk through this code, but the point is just for you to see that the Flexbox and table display can be used on the same elements. Flexbox just overrides the table properties in browsers that understand it. If you choose to float, be aware that if you are also choosing to feed old WebKit, the 2009 syntax, it has a bug where flex items that are also floated will disappear. Um, but all you have to do is add position relative to bring them back, logically, right? But again, this only applies to old browsers with the old syntax, so it's not something you have to worry about with current browsers. In the case of the floated icons, the only tiny piece that I needed to hide from the Flexbox supporting browsers was a left margin on the content block. That should only apply if the icon block is floated in order to keep the content block from wrapping underneath it. And I don't want it on if Flexbox is active because that would then add a huge gap between those two flex item blocks. So I use Modernizer's no Flexbox class to apply the left margin only in non-supporting browsers that will be using floats. So other than that, there's no other styles in this example that conflict and need to be isolated from each other. So with the fallback CSS in place in non-supporting browsers, the icons will simply be top aligned with the text, or if I'm using display table cell or inline block as my fallback, I can use vertical align middle to vertically center them with the block of text. And again, there's nothing wrong with either of these alignments. They're just a bit different than the Flexbox version. One of the things that often makes responsive web design tricky is dealing with different units of measurement across a line, such as pixels for margin and percentage for width. The calc function can help you with this, but only if you know every measurement across the line. If you have some items without explicit dimensions, because you want them to just size to their content, their text, what do you do? I've run into this a lot with forms, because ideally the label is some unknown length based on its text, and then the field is some percentage to fill the rest of the container, but what value do I give it? It's always nice to see how others handle it, so I ran across this responsive form on the Guardian's job site. This is my copy of it, so I could play around and see how they do things. They are smart. They just avoid the units problem entirely by just hiding the labels. Then they give all the fields a percentage width, including the button and the select menu, and then they change that percentage at different breakpoints. But when I made my copy, I ran into a couple small problems with this approach. Because the select menu is set to a percentage, not to its content length, the menu content can sometimes be cut off. Now I could fix this by tweaking the breakpoints, making sure I don't change the layout until I am sure that it can fit. But this is pretty unreliable. For one thing, you can't always create a whole new set of breakpoints to accommodate one piece of content on one page out of your whole site. Also, it's dependent on all of your users having the same font size and on the content in that menu never changing, neither of which I think are safe assumptions. The second problem is that there's a slight misalignment of the fields across the line, even though I use the same padding on all of them. Again, I could fix this by adjusting all the paddings, but again, it's going to vary a little bit by each browser, so it's also not a very reliable fix. But I can fix these tiny problems with a tiny bit of Flexbox. So first, I'm going to turn on Flexbox, just outside any media queries. It's going to put the items on a single row, but FlexWrap wrap allows them to wrap onto multiple rows as needed. So without FlexWrap, as in the previous examples, the fields would all stay on one row no matter what, even if the content's cut off or overflows. But with FlexWrap, they will be stacked on narrow screens and then automatically switch to side by side when there is room to fit. So it's similar to changing flex direction from column to row in a media query, but without needing any media query. So the breakpoint can happen automatically in a more natural spot. The items do stay row orientation the whole time. It's just that they may take up to 4 rows when the viewport is narrow. Next, I need to override the percentage widths and use the flex property instead to size the field wrappers. And I need to hide this rule from non-supporting browsers using the Modernizer Flexbox class so that they don't see width auto and they continue to use those percentage widths. So at first the fields will just be 100% wide, so each takes its own line on narrow screens. But in the first breakpoint I can change the flex values so that the fields size to their content instead of these arbitrary percentages that I assign. Now, this flex property is one of the foundations of Flexbox and a big part of what makes it so powerful. But it can be easy to misunderstand how it works and to use it in the wrong way. So we need to dip into the terminology, technical syntax stuff for just a bit. Basically, the flex property is set on flex items, not the container, but individual flex items to give them a proportional size. And it affects either their width or their height, whichever is the main size. And that's the dimension along the main axis. Again, main axis is set by flex direction. So when it's set to row, my main axis is horizontal and my main size is width. If flex direction is set to column, my main axis is vertical and my main size is height. And there's three components to a flex value because it's a shorthand property. The first is flex grow. It means how much the flex item will grow relative to others if there's extra space available on its line. Flex shrink means how much the item will shrink relative to others on its line if there's not enough space. And flex grow and flex shrink are both set to unitless integers like 0, 1, 2, because they're not specifying an absolute value, they're specifying a proportion, like the number of extra shares of space that they get. Flex basis is the initial starting dimension before the space is added on or taken away from the item, and it's set to any standard width or height value. So when I set these flex values on the 4 field wrappers, here's what it meant. I'm going to go backwards through the pieces because I think it makes more sense to start with flex basis since that is the starting size of the items. So the third value, auto, just tells the browser to use the natural content-based size of the field. The browser is actually first looking at the main size value, which in this case is width, since they're row direction and horizontal. But I've already overridden the explicit percentage widths with width auto, so without any explicit main size values, it has to use the intrinsic sizes of the items. So that's the starting point, and then the browser then looks to flex grow and flex shrink to decide if it can get bigger or smaller than that starting point. So flex shrink is the second value. Set to 1 on the text fields means they can shrink smaller than their natural size if needed to make everything fit. And flex shrink set to 0 on the select and button means don't let them shrink smaller because I don't want them, their text to ever get cut off. Flex grow is the first value. Set to 1 on the text fields means that each will get 1 share of any available extra width on a line. And flex grow set to 0 on the select and button means don't add on any pixels to their starting widths. So in other words, the select and the button will always stay at their content width no matter what, and then the text fields will grow to take up whatever space is left. So I never will have the problem of cut off text in the dropdown. So let's take a look at what we have so far. Outside of the media queries, I set flex basis to 100% so that each field takes up its own line, creating the appearance of a single column. Inside the 40M media query, I set flex basis to auto, so when there is room for more than one field to sit beside each other, they will move up to do so, and they will end up on one line once the viewport is wide enough. But this layout that the browser automatically creates is quite awkward looking, I would say. I would rather have the in-between layout like in the float version where the first field, the keywords field, is on a line by itself with the other 3 fields on a line together below. And I can refine the flex values within the existing media queries to prevent the button getting left on a line by itself. Specifically, I'm going to force the first field, the keywords field, to stay 100% wide instead of switching to auto like the other fields by keeping it with flex basis 100%. Then when the browser is a little wider, 50Ms, I will let it go to auto like the rest, and then all 4 fields will sit together on one line and size to their content at a minimum. So that fixes the layout issue, and it also fixes the cut off content problem in the select menu. So the last thing is to fix that mismatch in height between the inputs. All I have to do to fix that is add display flex to each field wrapper. That in turn is going to set align items to stretch, and then the items will stretch to match the height of their line. So then all fields will be exactly equal in height across the line. Now, walking through the Flexbox for this form step by step and teaching you each property along the way makes it seem like more work than it actually is. It's actually only 9 lines of CSS that I've added. So although the visual effect isn't huge in this case, neither is the effort to polish up this form. So I fixed the original 2 problems that I set out to solve, but I think the biggest enhancement here is that even though the Flexbox form still uses the same breakpoints as the float original, the fields inside are more responsive to their content. So overall, the layout of the fields looks more proportional inside each of these breakpoints. Content-driven breakpoints are better than device-size breakpoints, but they are still a decision that you are making based on what is best for hopefully the majority of your content, but not every single component or piece of content on every page. So Flexbox can enhance your components to be responsive within these breakpoints that you've chosen. Now, the job form was just a demo, but we use Flexbox in a similar way live at booking.com on the customer service form, which uses a fluid responsive layout. So using Flex, the fields fill the full width of their container, no matter its size. They switch from stack to 2 by 2 automatically as soon as they can fit beside each other. And by automatically, I mean no media queries. This is all of the CSS that's needed to create those 2 layouts. And there's no media query because the browser figures out what breakpoint to use for you by using Flexbox. So basically, when the viewport is narrow, the combination of the 40% starting width, the flex basis, and the pixel margin and padding makes the 2 inputs add up to more than 100%, which forces them to wrap and stack. But flex gross set to 1 ensures that when this happens, they stretch to fill the width rather than staying 40% wide. And so the flex property here is simply an enhancement on top of the floating and the width 43% that controls the layout of the form, and Flexbox is not available. The fallback looks a bit different, but I think that's an acceptable trade-off for being able to write just a few lines of CSS, no media queries, and being completely done with laying out an entire responsive form. Sometimes you will need a media query for the starting non-Flexbox styles, but you can add on Flexbox without media queries to enhance the alignment along the way. For instance, this article heading is basically the media block UI pattern that you see everywhere with an image plus a block of text beside it. Without Flexbox, I'm just using the default block stacking when narrow, and then I can switch to display table cell in a media query, one wider, to put the image and the text block beside each other. But I can make this orientation switch happen automatically with no media queries by using Flexbox. This is the structure that I'm working with, so there's image and text block as siblings inside a header block, and I want to make article header text move up beside article header image automatically. Here's the CSS to do that. The image and the text block will stack when they're narrow thanks to Flex Wrap, and then they'll switch to side by side when they can fit. And the flex basis values basically determine what this point is. It's whatever point 300 pixels, that flex basis, plus 20em, that flex basis, plus their padding can fit at. When those all add up to less than 100%, they can fit beside each other. So basically, you choose these flex basis values based on the minimum width that the content will look good at, because flex basis acts kind of like minimum width when wrapping is on. Now, to make this look different from the table cell version, I wanted to take advantage of Flexbox's various ways to align content and fill space. So I turned the text block into a flex container so that I can affect its children. The first child is the title, which I always want on a full line by itself, so I give it flex basis of 100%. The second child is the category, which can sit on the same line as the date, but I can make it flex to take up all the space in between the two, which pushes the date to the right side. And finally, I can use the line content property on the text block to push the title to the top of the text block and the category and date line to the bottom. So align content is like align items, but it affects the cross-axis alignment of the lines in a multi-line flex container, not the alignment of the items within those lines. So now the text block content is full width because the category has flex on it, that green box, and it's full height because of align content space between. Using Flex to push the date to the opposite side is a great enhancement for what happens when there's not enough room for both to fit on the same line. We have lots of ways to align content to opposite sides of a line with our old existing CSS. But if I used floating or text align to push the date to the right side, when the date needed to wrap, it would wrap down to the right edge, which looks kind of weird. If I use flex instead, it wraps to the left side, which looks a lot more natural. Also, if I use justify content space between to push these to opposite sides, it would wrap down to the left side. You can see a real example of this improved wrapping in use on booking.com. These are what we call mini info windows on the maps that show when you hover over a marker. And I use Flexbox to lay out the review score and the price on opposite sides of the same line. And Flexbox was the best choice because of the extreme flexibility that the mini info window needed in order to accommodate the unknown content and the 42 languages that we deal with on booking.com. So I couldn't give either of these two blocks a width, even in ems or percentages, because the length of the content in each can vary wildly. For instance, the review word may be super long in some languages, like this German example, or it might be absent altogether on new properties that don't have many reviews yet. The price could be who knows how many characters long, or it could say the word sold out, which again varies in length by language. So without set widths, inline-block would not work to move the price to the right side, so that was out. Table cell would work without set widths, but if the content was long, the two pieces could overlap instead of the second block wrapping to a new line, which would be totally acceptable, unacceptable, of course. Couldn't read the text then. So that left floating and Flexbox as my layout options, and I chose to use both. So I used float for older browsers, and then I overrode it with Flexbox. And I didn't have to use Modernizer and hide pieces of CSS from certain browsers. Flexbox just takes over if the browser understands it. So no matter what, the two blocks will appear side by side in all browsers, and they will wrap when needed. The wrapping and alignment of the text just isn't quite as nice looking in non-Flexbox browsers, but that was going to happen whether or not I use Flexbox as an enhancement here. So I hope that these examples give you some ideas for how to use Flexbox to deal better with sizing and spacing due to that variable width, variable height, and even variable content like we have here. Now, in responsive web design, you often need to shuffle content around visually, but you have to keep the same HTML order. And this can be sometimes hard to make a block go where you want it to when you are tied to this certain source order. But Flexbox can make this easier by using its order property, as well as some other properties that it has. So let me show you how the order property works with a simple example first. Remember my split navbar? I used relative positioning and a negative top value to move the navbar up, overlapping the same line as the logo. This is fine, but since the logo is not actually part of the list, it's not actually in the middle of the list, the links on either side can overlap it if the browser window gets too small. And I avoided this by using a media query to change the layout before that happens. But if the logo was actually moved in the flow to the middle of the list, then I wouldn't have to do this. And I can keep the logo before the links in the HTML, but I can move it visually and in the flow to the middle using the order property. You set the order property on Flex items to specify which order you want the browser to lay them out in their container, regardless of the HTML order. And the browser runs from the lowest numbers, including negative, to the highest. So you can think of it like assigning the items a position number in a line. So by default, all Flex items are in position 0. And since they're in the same position, the browser just uses their HTML order to lay them out. But if sibling Flex items have different order values from each other, the browser will lay them out in ascending order of those values. So I want the first two links to stay first, so they need the lowest order value. So I'll just keep them at the default of 0. The logo comes next, so it needs the next highest order value, 1. And then the last two links need to come after the logo, so they get the next highest order value, 2. Now that the logo is part of the line, not separate from it, it won't work to just have margin left auto on the throw a party link as before, because with every bit of extra space to its left side, it's going to squish the logo over on the left side instead of being in the middle. To fix this, I can use 2 auto margins, and the browser will simply divide the extra space on the line evenly between the 2 items with those margins. So throw a party already has margin left auto from before, but I'll add the same to the logo. So half of the extra space will go to the left side of the throw a party link, half to the left side of the logo, and thus the logo will be moved to the center. In order to make this work, I did have to move the logo from outside the UL to inside it at the same level as the other links. And that's because order only works on siblings within the same Flex container. You cannot move elements outside of their Flex container to before or after stuff that's outside that container. So this does make it limiting. You have more source order independence than with current layout methods, but you still don't have complete freedom to move anything anywhere. This ability to arrange content visually in a different order than it appears in the source can have accessibility implications too, both good and bad. The best way to use it is as a means to keep your content in logical order in the HTML instead of being forced to structure your HTML illogically simply to achieve some visual effect. So that's going to allow screen readers and other user agents that don't pay attention to CSS layout to still present the content in a logical order to users. The inaccessible way to use it would be the opposite. You structure your HTML illogically and use the order property to fix it visually. Screen readers are still going to read the illogical HTML order. Now, in either case, the tab order won't always match the expected visual order of left to right for left to right languages, top to bottom, which can be very disorienting to non-mouse users when their focus outline jumps around the page in a seemingly arbitrary way as they tab around. So the order property is not a blank check to move content around the page wherever you want. Other CSS3 layout modules like grid layout have much more robust and accessible reordering capabilities. But it is possible to use order in a smaller progressive enhancement sort of way without hurting accessibility. For instance, the order property can come in handy on responsive sites when you want to stack content on narrow mobile screens. As I said, one of the challenges with responsive web design is that the order in which you need to place your major content blocks in the HTML to make them stack in the desired sequence on mobile screens is not always the same as the HTML order they need to be in to make floating work on wider screens where you want to turn them into multiple columns. But again, Flexbox support was great on mobile browsers, so you might consider using the Flexbox order property to rearrange content just on mobile devices. And that way you can keep the HTML in the order that's needed for the desktop layout, where you don't want to use Flexbox yet for the entire page layout, without worrying about users of old IE seeing an order that's different than the one you had planned. So let me give you an example that's accessible and that uses mobile-only reordering. So on this recipe, I could use the Flexbox order property to move the photo from its HTML position before the ingredients to above the recipe title on mobile only. So in the styles outside any media queries, I set flex direction to column to stack all my major content blocks in a single column. And then I set the order value of the image to -1. All the other flex items inside the recipe container have the default order value of 0. -1 is smaller, so the image will come first. It will move up to the top of the stack. And then on the desktop view, I simply turn off Flexbox by setting the recipe's display back to block. So that puts the image back in the normal flow order and then I can float it to the right beside the ingredients list. So there's no concern about Flexbox support on desktop because I'm not using it there. And any mobile browsers that don't support it will simply see the image on top of the ingredients. The Guardian now uses Flexbox for their layout. They take the opposite approach. They put things in the HTML order that is needed for mobile, and then they do some reordering on the wide view. So this is the mobile order. And when wide, you can see that they have reordered things a bit, but they haven't used the order property to do it. Instead, they used flex direction row reverse to place items side by side, just like flex direction row, but run them from right to left instead of left to right. So you have reverse values in flex direction and in flex wrap, and they give you additional options for visually reordering content. these are just a few examples of how you could use Flexbox now to solve real-world responsive web design challenges in a progressive way. Using Flexbox for non-essential cosmetic enhancements like the examples I've shown you may seem trivial, but they're a really low-risk way to try Flexbox and get comfortable with the syntax and how it works. So I want to end with some tips for adding it to your workflow today. First, you'll need to decide which syntaxes you want to support. I've just shown the standard unprefixed properties throughout the examples on these slides, but that's just for ease of presenting and learning. Doesn't mean I'm saying that you should not use any prefixed versions in the real world. Which you use is up to you. If you want to catch every single browser possible, you will need to use the 2009 syntax. But personally, I don't recommend using it, mostly because it's slow to render. Also, if you're using Flexbox as an enhancement, the browsers that you are targeting with the 2009 syntax can get the same fallback version that you are providing for non-supporting browsers. So it's up to you, but keep these issues in mind. Once you've decided which syntaxes to support, you'll need to set up your tools to make working with these syntaxes easy. There is no need to memorize the different browser variants. Let your tools do that for you. Auto prefixer is one option. However, you cannot prevent it from adding the 2009 syntax. You can exclude it, can exclude those browsers that use the 2009 syntax, but then they will be excluded from all of the CSS that it prefixes, not just the Flexbox related properties. So I prefer to use SAS or less mix-ins because then you can customize them to add just the variants that you want. Also, as I've shown in some of these demos, Modernizer is an important tool when working with Flexbox. It's not always needed, but it does sometimes come in handy. If you are using SAS, you can use this simple mix-in that I wrote to append the Modernizer classes onto your styles. Here's how you would use it. So let's say you have a floated sidebar as your fallback, and you have a 320 pixel left margin on main content to move it out of the way of the sidebar. And you want to override this if Flexbox is on. So you can just call the supports Flexbox mixin within the main content rule to override the 320 pixel left margin with a 20 pixel one. And then here's the CSS that it would produce. It just adds a version of the main content rule with the Flexbox class in front. So now you've got your tools, you've chosen your syntaxes, now you need to choose what to do for non-supporting browsers. I don't think that you need to try to imitate every Flexbox visual effect, like vertical centering, with some sort of fallback CSS. That defeats the purpose of progressive enhancement. So sometimes you may do nothing for non-supporting browsers at all, and that is totally fine. But if you are using Flexbox to control the size and placement of items, you probably will want to have some sort of starter layout styles in place. All of the examples I've shown have used floating or table cell or inline block as the starter layout CSS, and any of these are fine to use. Basically, just pick whichever one you normally would if Flexbox wasn't available. Lay it out the way you normally would, but without hacking to fix all the details, and then add Flexbox on top to take care of all of those refinements. Flexbox will override and can coexist with any of these three layout methods. It does not override absolute positioning though, so if you are using that as your starter styles, you will need to isolate it using Modernizer. But again, you can use Flexbox with other things because Flexbox is not all or nothing. You can keep using floats or table display or whatever else you use to create layouts. Just add on Flexbox in one spot to add one little enhancement. Start experimenting with it and see what happens. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Have a seat. I always like them when you see the counter going down to like a few seconds, and then I always count the twitches of the PPK with it. Because like the counter goes down, he's like, I gotta go in there now. Well, I wish you had shown some examples and some things we can use in real practice. Because I mean, these Flexbox talks are always so boring and just hypothetical. The interesting thing is this time people ask questions. The best thing is that you answered most of them in your last slides, so that's useful. one of the questions were, and I found that as well, that some of your examples looked very not modular, which is like, you set the class of the second link rather than doing an nth child of 2.
Yeah.
Is there an issue with nth child selectors and support, or is it just because?
No, it's mainly
reasons?
just for presentation. So sometimes I use class names and things that I wouldn't use in real life, just because it makes it easier for you to tell what that class name is connected to, visually for a demo purpose. So yeah.
Okay. So that was the answer to that one, that it looks very tailored. It was tailored for you. And then you say it's bad.
No,
Come on,
I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any problem with Flexbox and those sort of pseudo classes and things.
Excellent. Does Flexbox order property influence screen readers?
No, it does not change the screen reader in order. It's also not supposed to change the tabbing order. Firefox disobeys and it changes the tabbing order, but all the other browsers respect the spec and do not change the tabbing order. So they still will use the HTML order.
Yeah. One of them kind of irked me because, you showed a great example of how progressive enhancement is meant to do. Like, don't make it look the same in every browser with like hacking it. And absolute positioning, I think, is the main thing, to let it just die.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because it is just terrible. It doesn't scale. Even with percentages, even the calculations don't work properly in a lot of cases. It's just terrible. But why not use graceful degradation approach with modernizer, since browsers like IE 8 and 9 will be gone anytime soon? It's like a crack team of engineers and designers are working on a new browser in Microsoft. I heard about that.
Yes.
So do you think there are environments where you really should do a graceful degradation approach? Have you reached it, or?
Well, I think it is the case. For instance, sometimes in my work at Booking.com, I do know that there's a visual effect that I want to go for that I know I cannot do with floating or something. So I know that I'm going to be using some Flexbox property to begin with, and then I have to go backwards and think, well, how would I get close to this with other CSS that I have? So I guess in those cases, I am kind of using more of a graceful degradation mindset, but I'm always setting up my, logical HTML, making sure it's in a good order. I want it to just, work from the beginning, and then, my Flexbox just be an enhancement on top of that.
You made a good point at saying like we have to support 27 languages. When I did sites that had like more than 30 languages, I learned much more about progressive enhancement and about creativity than before, because we just do layouts in Photoshop with English, and then we don't realize we need much more space for different bits and bobs.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a big design challenge, and Flexbox makes that a lot easier. Even if you don't have multiple languages you're supporting on your site, you have variable content that you can't always count on that's coming from a content management system or something like that. So it helps to make your stuff more flexible to that different type of content.
Do you find that when using order and content management systems that people get confused? That showing showing up with somewhere else, but then where they edited?
I haven't had that problem, but I haven't worked so much with those sort of content management systems lately. So,
why is the default direction row? It makes Flexbox feel like an inline element property while it's mostly used on block elements.
I'm not sure. I know we have someone here who has worked on the Flexbox spec.
Yeah, if
so
only we had
ask.
a specification writer here. Yeah.
So I'm not sure why that's the default, but yeah. So you can make. Also, I didn't include this just because it's just another detail. But you can set something to display, not just display flex, but display inline flex, which will make the flex container as a whole act kind of like an inline block. So that's another option when you're using Flexbox.
I use Masonry. I don't. I use Masonry to create a tile page like Pinterest. Could Flexbox be used for this as well?
I have used Flexbox some for gallery sort of reordering. Yeah, where you have like multiple rows and you can just use Flexbox and use justify content to space out each row so that it fills the full width. The only issue with that, I think, is that when you get to like the bottom row, I guess on Pinterest there never is a bottom row, but if you get to the bottom row, you can't say, okay, stop stretching out full width on this bottom row. So if you have one item that goes on the bottom row, then it will like stretch to the full width. So right now we don't have like last line pseudo classes for like Flexbox because it's not an actual like DOM element.
Didn't Hayden Pickering have some solution for that in his?
With like text align justify?
Yeah. Okay, that was one of the solutions there. Okay. What about Jaffa the Cake's warning, don't use Flexbox for overall page layout? Why shouldn't we use people's quote out of context and not read the article?
I do agree that Flexbox is not really the right choice for overall page layout, um, uh, because it, well, for one thing, you have that issue with support on, old browsers. Um, it is a tiny percentage, but when we're talking about the whole overall page layout, you probably want them to see some overall page layout. Also, that support issue becomes even bigger if you're talking about excluding the 2009 syntax browsers. So then we're talking about maybe 10% or something of browsers. Um, and it also just, it's hard to explain. Grid layout is better for that because it gives you more control over where those kind of major content sections go, and can give you more source order independence. But then within those sections, you can use Flexbox to lay out and size the kind of pieces inside.
Last question, as we're already running out of time, more or less. What about performance? Is there any, well, I mean, it's a massive topic, I think, but like, is there any downside to using Flexbox in comparison to floats and positioning?
From the testing that's been done on it so far, the 2009 syntax was definitely slower than floats, but the current syntax performed okay. I think that there should be more testing done on that because it is something where you're not specifying explicit widths for a lot of your containers, so the text has to do a lot of reflowing. So while it might not be slower, there sometimes are issues where it's first is like, full width, and then as content comes in, it may have to kind of shift. So that might create more of a perception of a performance problem than an actual performance problem.
I mean, you said like the WebKit 2009 support is much better on mobile, but all the old stock browsers on Android still would have that one, right?
Yeah, like the older Android devices. I think it's maybe like, according to Can, I use like 8% or something like that. Yeah, would use the 2009 syntax. But again, on mobile, if we're talking about mobile browsers and mobile layouts, they're generally very simple visually. So it's a lot easier to do fallbacks for those sorts of layouts with just floats and things that we have already. A lot of times you're just mainly doing stacking sort of things. So it's not as big a deal if you don't have Flexbox there, in my opinion. It's more when you get to desktop and you're doing more complex sort of layout, jiggering around.
So the Guardian's approach of like a mobile first and then using Flexbox to do the desktop layout might be the easier one that way?
Um, yeah, I suppose so. But I mean, yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Excellent. So thanks very much. Now we get half an hour break before he jumps on stage and drags me off. Half an hour break downstairs, coffee, plates. Don't bring things back. Leave them there. Stack them nicely. Give them to people. And then we're back here at 11:10. Whoever is too late has to sing a song.